The French evacuation system followed a carefully designed chain. When a soldier fell wounded, his first contact with medical care came through these stretcher bearers. They would apply first aid at the point of injury, stopping hemorrhage, stabilizing fractures, administering morphine for pain. Then began the arduous journey rearward. First to the regimental aid post, poste de secours régimentaire, a crude bunker or dugout where a physician might provide further treatment. From there, the journey continued to the advanced dressing station, poste de secours avancé, then to the divisional clearing station, ambulance divisionaire, and finally to a field hospital, hôpital de campagne, or evacuation hospital, hôpital D evacuation, far behind the lines. The entire system depended on the stretcher bearers who formed its first crucial link. This evacuation chain evolved substantially as the war progressed. In 1914, during the War of Movement, aid posts were improvised in abandoned buildings, and evacuation routes changed daily as front lines shifted. By 1915, with the entrenchment of positions, more permanent medical facilities were established at regular intervals behind the lines, connected by designated evacuation routes marked with Red Cross flags or lanterns at night. A report from the Service de Santé dated June 1916 provides detailed specifications for this evacuation infrastructure. Regimental aid posts established in reinforced dugouts no more than 800 meters behind front lines. Advanced dressing stations in concrete bunkers, or you've seen the sepia photographs, mud-splashed men in horizon blue uniforms. Crouched low in shell-cratered landscapes, French soldiers charging across no man's land toward German machine guns, the gleaming medals, the propaganda posters. But what about the men who ventured into that same hellscape unarmed, carrying nothing but stretchers and medical supplies? The Brancardiers, French stretcher bearers who crawled through mud so thick it could drown a man, beneath shells that turned forests into matchsticks, to reach the wounded and dying. What drove these men to walk directly into artillery fire with no weapons to defend themselves? What did they witness that haunts history's shadows? And what skills turned ordinary civilians into battlefield saviors when medicine itself struggled to keep pace with industrialized killing? They were the first hands that touched a wounded soldier, the first faces he saw when smoke cleared from his eyes. They carried men whose legs had been turned to red mist by artillery. They held compresses against gushing neck wounds while shells dropped around them. They whispered comfort to dying boys calling for their mothers in the darkness between trenches. And still, they remain among the most overlooked heroes of the Great War. Their stories buried beneath the narratives of generals and politicians who never felt a stretcher handle cut into their palms or heard the death rattle of a man drowning in his own blood. If you value documented Viking and Norse-era history like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from the French military archives and the Imperial War Museum's extensive collection of first-person accounts from the Western Front. Now back to the information. The year is 1914. In sun-drenched August, war erupts across Europe. By September, French soldiers in bright red and blue uniforms march proudly toward the front, still believing in a quick victory. Instead, they meet industrial slaughter on a scale humanity had never witnessed. At the Battle of the Frontiers, 27,000 French soldiers die in a single day. August 22nd, 1914, the highest one-day death toll in French military history. Within weeks, the Western Front transforms into a labyrinth of trenches stretching from Switzerland to the North Sea. And in this nightmare landscape, a new kind of hero emerges, known by a name that would become legendary, the Brancardiers. They appeared as shadows in the smoke, moving against the tide of retreating soldiers, heading toward danger rather than away from it. On battlefields, where every instinct screamed to take cover, they worked exposed. In an army where officers barked orders and men obeyed without question, Brancardiers often worked with near autonomy, making split-second medical decisions that determined who might live and who would certainly die. The French High Command hadn't prepared for the scale of casualties. In the war plans drafted before 1914, they had allocated just 4 stretcher bearers per company of 250 men. 4 men to collect, treat, and evacuate the wounded from battlefields where casualty rates sometimes reached 60%. These French stretcher bearers were, in most cases, not professional soldiers. They were musicians, former bandsmen in military units, reassigned because their skills were deemed expendable in combat. They were conscientious objectors, unwilling to kill but ready to save lives. They were priests and seminarians who exchanged the sanctity of churches for blood-soaked dressing stations. They were artists, intellectuals, teachers, and farmers. And unlike combat troops, they carried no weapons, only stretchers, medical kits, and morphine. The French army, unlike its British counterpart, did not create dedicated medical corps units before the war. Instead, when mobilization began in August 1914, it pulled men from existing regiments based on physical capability, education level, and previous medical experience. Many were selected simply because they could read the labels on medicine bottles or had steady hands. Some volunteered when commanders asked for men willing to serve without weapons. Others were assigned the role without choice, often those deemed too valuable to lose in frontal assaults, but not essential enough to keep in rear echelon positions. One such man was Maurice Genevois, a 24-year-old graduate of the prestigious École Normale Supérieure. Originally an infantry lieutenant, he served as a stretcher-bearer after being wounded at Les Éparges in April 1915. His memoir, Ceux de 14, Those of 1914, provides one of the most vivid accounts of a Brancardier's experience when we work in a realm between life and death, and ground churned to liquid by shells and blood. We are not soldiers, nor quite civilians. We exist in a gray zone where our only allegiance is to the broken men we carry. The name Brancardier itself comes from brancard, the French word for stretcher. But these men were far more than just carriers. While their British and American counterparts received as little as 2 weeks of medical training, French Brancardiers underwent a rigorous 10-week training course before deployment. They learned to give morphine injections, apply tourniquets, treat gas victims, and maintain a clear head while shells exploded around them. By 1916, their skill set had expanded to include hemorrhage control, pain management, and even rudimentary surgical techniques when no doctors were available. This training took place at specialized medical depots established at Etaples and later at Le Havre. The curriculum was developed by the Service de Santé, the French military medical service, and evolved rapidly as the war progressed and new weapons created new types of wounds. The first cohorts in 1914 learned basic first aid and evacuation techniques. By 1915, the training had expanded to include specialized modules on gas treatment and shock management. By 1916, Brancardiers were learning field surgery techniques previously reserved for physicians, including emergency tracheotomies and fasciotomies to relieve compartment syndrome in crushed limbs. Dr. Alexis Carrel, who would later win a Nobel Prize for his medical innovations, helped design protocols for wound treatment that he taught directly to Brancardiers at a special facility near Compiègne. These men must become the extended hands of surgeons, he wrote in a memo to the French High Command in January 1916. The golden hour for saving a wounded soldier begins the moment he falls. If we wait until he reaches a field hospital, we have already lost precious time. The Brancardier must be capable of making life or death medical decisions in the field. A typical day of training began at 5 in the morning with physical conditioning. Stretcher carries over obstacle courses designed to simulate trench systems. By 8, classroom instruction began, covering anatomy, wound ballistics, and triage protocols. Afternoons were dedicated to practical exercises, bandaging techniques, splinting fractures, and administering emergency medications. Evenings included lectures on the psychological aspects of casualty care and the ethics of battlefield triage. At night, trainees practiced evacuations in complete darkness, learning to work by touch alone. In the French system, a division of roughly 12,000 men would have its own corps of stretcher bearers, the Groupe des Brancardiers Divisionnaires. Each regiment also had its dedicated stretcher bearers. 4 men per company, just 4 men responsible for hundreds of lives. Think about that. 4 men to evacuate all casualties from a frontline position that might stretch for hundreds of meters. And when battles intensified, like at Verdun in 1916, those 4 men might face hundreds of wounded in a single day. The organizational structure placed Brancardiers at every level of the French Army medical system. At the company level, the 4 designated stretcher bearers worked directly alongside combat troops, often sharing their dugouts and rations. At the battalion level, a dedicated squad of 16 Brancardiers managed the regimental aid posts. At the divisional level, the Groupe des Brancardiers Divisionnaires consisted of 72 men commanded by a medical officer, typically a captain or major from the Service de Santé. This multi-layered system was designed to create a seamless evacuation chain from front to rear. When a soldier fell wounded in no man's land, company stretcher bearers would retrieve him, often under direct fire. They would provide immediate first aid, then carry him to the battalion aid post, where he might receive more comprehensive treatment. From there, divisional bearers would transport him further rearward to field hospitals or evacuation points for motorized ambulances. As the war progressed, this system adapted to the changing nature of the battlefield. During the Battle of Verdun, where the front lines shifted constantly amid apocalyptic artillery bombardments, Brancardiers established relay points, designated locations where one team would hand off wounded to another. creating a human chain that stretched from the front lines to field hospitals kilometers away. This relay system, first implemented by the French Second Army in February 1916, was later adopted by all Allied forces. A French officer at Verdun wrote in his journal on February 26, 1916, "The Brancardiers have not slept for 3 days. They move like ghosts through the fog, their uniforms stiff with frozen blood, yet they never stop. When one falls, another takes his place without hesitation. Unlike soldiers who could take cover or return fire, stretcher bearers had to move across open ground, making them perfect targets. German snipers, despite conventions against targeting medical personnel, often deliberately aimed for the Red Cross armbands that identified stretcher bearers. At the Battle of the Somme, one French stretcher bearer unit lost 38 of its 50 men in a single afternoon while attempting to retrieve wounded from no man's land. The physical demands were crushing. A standard French stretcher of the period, the Model 1890, weighed 12 kilograms empty. Add a wounded soldier, often a tall, muscular man weighing 80 kilograms or more, and the bearers might be carrying 90 to 100 kilograms between them. Now imagine carrying that weight through knee-deep mud, up steep embankments, and down narrow, twisting trenches, all while trying not to jostle the wounded man whose pain could send him into fatal shock. The Model 1890 stretcher itself was a marvel of wartime engineering. Constructed of ashwood handles with canvas bedding reinforced with hemp rope, it could be folded for transport and deployed in seconds. Each stretcher came with leather, carrying straps that could be adjusted to accommodate bearers of different heights, crucial for maintaining a level carrying platform over uneven terrain. By 1916, modifications had been made to accommodate specialized needs, brackets for holding plasma bottles, slots for medical record cards, and waterproof covers to protect wounded from rain and chemical agents. But the equipment carried by Brancardiers extended far beyond just stretchers. Each man carried a medical haversack containing essential supplies, field dressings, tourniquets, morphine syrettes, scissors, hemostatic clamps, antiseptic solutions, and sterile gauze. They carried water bottles, not just for themselves, but for wounded men dying of thirst. Many kept extra chocolate or cigarettes, small comforts that could calm a terrified, injured soldier, and most carried personal items given to them by the men they saved. Photographs, letters, watches, rings, items they promised to return to families if the wounded man didn't survive. The physical toll on their bodies was severe and specific. Medical records from French military hospitals show a pattern of injuries unique to stretcher bearers: chronic shoulder dislocations, lumbar vertebrae compression, torn rotator cuffs, and distinctive calluses and stress fractures in the hands. A medical study conducted at Val-de-Grâce Military Hospital in 1917 documented that the average Brancardier lost 15% of his body weight within 3 months of frontline service due to the extreme caloric demands of their work. In good conditions, on solid ground, 2 men could manage a stretcher, but in the muddy quagmire of places like Passchendaele or the Argonne, it took 4 men, sometimes 6, to move a single wounded soldier. And even then, progress was agonizingly slow. A journey of 3 kilometers, the typical distance from front line to field hospital, could take 4 hours or more. The mud itself became an enemy as lethal as any German bullet. In his memoir, Brancardier Marcel Duhamel described the conditions at Verdun in April 1916. "The earth has turned to soup. Each step is a battle against the mud that tries to swallow you whole. We lost 2 men yesterday, not to shells, but to drowning when they slipped into a water-filled crater while carrying a stretcher. The wounded man they were carrying drowned with them." French military records confirm these accounts with stark statistics. During the Battle of the Somme from July to November 1916, the French Sixth Army recorded 423 stretcher bearers lost to battlefield hazards other than enemy fire, primarily mud-related accidents, exhaustion, and exposure. An after-action report from the French 10th Army noted, "Evacuation routes have become impassable quagmires where men sink to their waists. Stretcher parties require 6 to 8 men for a single casualty, and even then may take 6 hours to cover 1 kilometer. We are losing bearers faster than they can be replaced." The nature of the mud varied by sector and season, creating different challenges. In Champagne's chalky soil, rain created a slick, greasy surface that offered no purchase for boots. In Flanders, clay, heavy earth. The mud became adhesive, sucking at feet and stretcher poles with each step. In the Argonne's forest floor, a thin crust of seemingly solid ground often concealed watery pits beneath, creating deadly traps for heavily burdened stretcher teams. Specialized techniques evolved to meet these challenges. In particularly bad sections, Brancardiers would lay stretcher bridges, planks salvaged from destroyed buildings or duckboards taken from trench floors, creating temporary pathways across the worst mud. When even this proved insufficient, they developed relay systems where a stretcher would be passed from hand to hand along a human chain, with men standing on any available solid ground. The relentless arithmetic of battlefield evacuation created impossible choices. With limited stretchers and bearers, who would be carried first? The officer screaming orders through shattered teeth, the young private silently bleeding internally, the screaming man with half his face missing, or the quiet one with a seemingly minor wound that might fester into gangrene. French medical doctrine established a triage system that seems coldly logical on paper. Salvageable wounded first, dying cases last, but in the chaos of battle, with darkness falling and artillery pounding the evacuation routes, such decisions tormented the stretcher bearers. One Brancardier at the Chemin des Dames wrote, "I still hear them calling for me in my dreams, the men we had to leave until morning because there were too many." Too many. The French army formalized its triage protocols in a manual distributed to medical officers and senior Brancardiers in July 1915. It established 4 categories of wounded: légèrement blessés, lightly wounded, could walk without assistance, and would likely return to duty; transportable, required stretcher evacuation, but had good prospects for survival if treated promptly; urgent, required immediate medical intervention to survive, highest priority for evacuation; moribund, dying, unlikely to survive, regardless of treatment, lowest evacuation priority. The manual gave precise instructions for marking casualties with colored tags: white for light wounds, yellow for transportable, red for urgent, black for dying. But in practice, such clinical categorization often broke down. Brancardiers frequently ignored these guidelines, making decisions based on personal connections, instinct, or simply who grabbed their sleeve first in the chaos of a crowded aid post. Lieutenant Paul Tuffrau, a medical officer with the French 8th Division, described witnessing such decisions. "I saw a Brancardier ignore direct orders to evacuate an officer first. Instead, he took a young private who had been quietly waiting, his intestines held in place with a belt. When questioned, the bearer simply said, 'This one will live if we move him now. That one will die regardless.' He was right on both counts." By 1915, the French High Command recognized that the bright red and blue uniforms that had served French armies since Napoleonic times were virtual death sentences on the modern battlefield. The horizon blue uniform became standard issue, a concession to the grim reality that visibility meant vulnerability. But for Brancardiers, visibility remained necessary. They needed to be seen by both sides as non-combatants. The Red Cross armbands and unarmed status were supposed to protect them under the Geneva Convention. The reality? German artillery rarely distinguished between combat troops and medical personnel. Gas attacks made no such distinctions either. When chlorine or phosgene gas rolled across no man's land, Brancardiers had to don masks that restricted vision and breathing, already difficult while carrying stretchers, or risk death by asphyxiation. Many chose to give their masks to the wounded, sacrificing their own safety. The weapons of industrial warfare created wounds unlike anything medical science had prepared for. Artillery didn't just kill, it obliterated. High explosive shells could turn a human being into unrecognizable fragments. Shrapnel tore through flesh and bone, leaving metal fragments too numerous to remove. Machine guns could cut a man in half or punch dozens of holes through his body in seconds. Gas burned eyes, blistered skin, and dissolved lungs from within. For the Brancardiers, this meant encountering horrors that defied description. One stretcher bearer, a former seminarian named Philippe Leclerc, wrote to his brother in January 1917, "I have seen things no man should see. A wound is not a clean thing like in the medical textbooks. It is violation. It is desecration. The human body turned inside out." French military medical statistics from the period illustrate the distribution of wounds the Brancardiers encountered. Artillery was responsible for approximately 70% of all battlefield injuries, many involving multiple trauma sites. Shell fragments created jagged, contaminated wounds that frequently led to gas gangrene. Machine gun bullets, smaller but traveling at higher velocities than rifle rounds, created hydrostatic shockwaves that devastated internal organs, even when entry wounds appeared minor. Bayonet wounds, though less common by 1916, created deep punctures ideal for bacterial infection. And then there was gas. The first major chlorine gas attack against French positions at Ypres in April 1915 caught medical services completely unprepared. Brancardiers found themselves facing casualties with symptoms they'd never been trained to treat: frothing mouths, blinded eyes, blue skin, and the distinctive sound of air whistling through fluid-filled lungs, a sound veterans called the drowning death. By mid-1915, French stretcher bearers received specialized training in gas casualty management. They carried sodium bicarbonate solutions to neutralize chlorine and copper sulfate for phosgene exposure. They learned to position gas victims for optimal breathing, draining fluids from lungs when possible, and administering oxygen when available, which was rarely. Against mustard gas, which burned skin on contact and caused massive blistering, they applied protective petroleum jelly and specialized bandages to prevent wounds from spreading. The psychological toll was immense. Modern psychiatrists would recognize the symptoms as severe PTSD, the 1,000-yard stare, the trembling hands, the inability to sleep without nightmares. But in 1915, such reactions were often dismissed as shell shock, or worse, cowardice. Stretcher bearers suffered these invisible wounds at higher rates than combat troops, according to French military medical records analyzed in 2008. The reason? Combat soldiers could discharge tension through action, firing weapons, taking cover, advancing, retreating. Brancardiers could only witness and respond. They couldn't shoot back at what was killing the men in their care. They couldn't run away. Their only option was to continue forward, again and again, into the maelstrom. French military psychiatrist Dr. André Léry, who treated numerous psychological casualties at the Val-de-Grâce military hospital, noted the distinctive nature of stretcher-bearer trauma in a medical journal article published in 1918. These men experience a unique form of battle neurosis. Unlike the infantry soldier who fears primarily for his own survival, the Brancardier carries the additional burden of responsibility for others. They witness suffering without the psychological release of aggressive action. They make life-or-death decisions dozens of times daily. The cumulative effect is a profound moral injury that our current therapeutic approaches are inadequate to address. Records from French military hospitals show that by 1917, stretcher bearers were being evacuated for psychological casualties at a rate 3 times higher than frontline infantry. Common diagnoses included tremor nerveux, nervous tremors, mutisme hystérique, hysterical mutism, and syndrome de l'épuisement moral, syndrome of moral exhaustion. Treatment methods were primitive by modern standards: rest, sedation, occasionally hypnosis, and in severe cases, electric shock therapy intended to jolt patients back to normal function. Many Brancardiers coped through dissociation, a psychological defense mechanism where they separated themselves emotionally from the horrors they witnessed. Jean Bernier, a stretcher bearer with the French 27th Infantry Division, described this process in his journal. You develop a second self who does the work. He carries the broken bodies, applies the tourniquets, gives the morphine. Meanwhile, your true self hides somewhere deep inside, waiting for a moment when it's safe to emerge again. Some men never find their way back to themselves. If you value documented Viking and Norse-era history like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. Despite the danger and trauma, stretcher bearers developed techniques and innovations that saved countless lives. French Brancardiers pioneered the use of psychological first aid, talking to wounded men during evacuation, keeping them conscious, alert, and focused on survival. They developed specialized carries for different wound types, a particular hold for chest wounds that minimized bleeding, another for broken limbs to prevent bone fragments from causing further damage. They became experts at improvisation. When standard stretchers were unavailable, they created makeshift carriers from rifles and greatcoats. They fashioned splints from rifle stocks, tourniquets from belts, bandages from shirts. The Brancardier's pockets were pharmacies unto themselves, morphine ampules, antiseptic packets, field dressings, even sachets of sugar to treat shock. The French Medical Service documented these field innovations in a series of technical bulletins distributed to medical units beginning in August 1915, titled Improvisations médicales de campagne, Field Medical Improvisations. These publications collected and standardized techniques developed by Brancardiers on the front lines. They included detailed illustrations of makeshift traction splints created from bayonets and puttees, emergency cricothyrotomy techniques using fountain pen casings as breathing tubes, and methods for using shell casings as sterile containers for antiseptic solutions. One particularly significant innovation came from a Brancardier named André Martin, a former watchmaker from Lyon, who, in October 1916, developed a modified Thomas splint for femur fractures that could be applied in under 2 minutes without removing the wounded man's clothing. The Attelle Martin splint was officially adopted by the French Army in 1917 and credited with reducing mortality from femur fractures from 80% to less than 30%. Brancardiers also pioneered techniques for mass casualty management that would later influence civilian disaster response protocols. During heavy bombardments, when dozens or hundreds of wounded arrived simultaneously at aid stations, they implemented a system called groupement par gravité, grouping by severity, physically arranging casualties in concentric circles with the most severely wounded in the center, closest to medical supplies and personnel. This system, first documented at Verdun in March 1916, is recognizable as the direct ancestor of modern disaster triage protocols. The French evacuation system followed a carefully designed chain. When a soldier fell wounded, his first contact with medical care came through these stretcher bearers. They would apply first aid at the point of injury, stopping hemorrhage, stabilizing fractures, administering morphine for pain. Then began the arduous journey rearward, first to the regimental aid post, poste de secours régimentaire, a crude bunker or dugout where a physician might provide further treatment. From there, the journey continued to the advanced dressing station, poste de secours avancé, then to the divisional clearing station, ambulance divisionnaire, and finally to a field hospital, hôpital de campagne, or evacuation hospital, hôpital d'evacuation, far behind the lines. The entire system depended on the stretcher bearers who formed its first crucial link. The statistics tell a sobering story. For the French army, the stretcher bearer casualty rate averaged 31% across the war, meaning nearly 1/3 of all Brancardiers became casualties themselves. At certain battles, the rate was much higher. At Verdun, during the worst months of 1916, some stretcher bearer units suffered 60% casualties. Their life expectancy on the front lines was measured in weeks, not months, yet volunteers kept coming. When the call went out for new Brancardiers, men stepped forward. Why? Many spoke of duty, of moral obligation. Others found purpose in saving lives while their comrades took them. Some saw it as religious calling, particularly the Catholic priests, who served in large numbers as French Brancardiers. One such priest, Père François Rivet, wrote, "In the confessional, I saved souls. On the battlefield, I save bodies. God's work continues in different forms." The relationship between stretcher bearers and the men they carried was profound. Infantry soldiers developed superstitions around certain Brancardiers known for getting wounded men out alive against impossible odds. They gave them nicknames. Le Fantôme, for one who seemed to appear like a ghost wherever men fell. L'Ange, for another whose gentle handling eased the worst pain. At Chemin des Dames in 1917, a French infantry captain reported, "My men will follow me into machine gun fire without question. But it is the Brancardiers they truly worship. They know that if they fall, these unarmed men will come for them, even if it means crawling through hell itself." The technology of evacuation evolved throughout the war. Early in the conflict, wounded might wait hours or even days before reaching proper medical care. By 1917, the French had developed a more sophisticated system, including motorized ambulances that could transport wounded from collecting points to field hospitals in a fraction of the time. Light railways, narrow-gauge tracks laid behind the lines, carried wounded men by the thousands when roads became impassable. But the crucial first stage, the recovery of wounded from the battlefield itself, remained unchanged. No technology could replace the Brancardier with his stretcher. Moving on foot through terrain too broken for any vehicle, searching for fallen men among the shell holes and tangles of barbed wire, the French military awarded the Croix de Guerre, the War Cross, to stretcher bearers, who demonstrated exceptional courage. The citations often read simply, "Went to retrieve wounded under heavy fire," or "continued evacuating casualties despite being wounded himself." Such understated language hardly captured the reality, men walking directly into artillery barrages, crawling through machine gun fire, remaining exposed while others took cover. One such citation from October 1916 reads, "Brancardier Marcel Bonnet, aged 22, of the 114th Infantry Regiment. During the attack on Hill 304, he made 17 journeys into no man's land over a period of 36 hours without rest, retrieving wounded from within 20 meters of the German lines, wounded twice himself. He refused evacuation and continued his work until collapsing from exhaustion." The winter of 1916-17 was the coldest in French meteorological records to that point. Temperatures plunged to minus 20 degrees Celsius on the Western Front. For the Brancardiers, this created new challenges. Wounded men froze to death before they could be reached. Blood froze on stretchers, sticking to the canvas. Morphine syrettes froze solid and became unusable. The stretcher bearers' own hands, unable to wear proper gloves while performing delicate medical procedures, suffered frostbite and chilblains. A Brancardier named Jules Marchand wrote in his diary on January 12, 1917, "The cold is our enemy, now more than the Boche." I found 3 men this morning who had been wounded yesterday. They were frozen solid, their blood turned to red ice crystals on their uniforms. I wept as we carried them back, not because they were dead, but because yesterday they had been alive when we could not reach them. As the war ground on, the physical and mental reserves of the stretcher bearers depleted. Many who had volunteered with idealistic notions found themselves transformed by what they witnessed. Alcohol consumption among medical personnel reached concerning levels. A French Medical Corps report from 1918 noted that brandy rations intended for wounded were increasingly consumed by the stretcher bearers themselves as a means of continuing function under unbearable conditions. Sleep deprivation became normal. During major offensives, Brancardiers might work for 72 hours without rest, catching minutes of sleep while squatting in trenches between evacuation runs. Their bodies adapted to constant movement, developing muscular hypertrophy in shoulders and legs from carrying stretchers. Their hands grew calloused from stretcher handles, their backs chronically strained. Yet they developed a dark humor that helped them survive psychologically. They gave nicknames to particularly dangerous evacuation routes. Boulevard des Morts, Boulevard of the Dead. Le Chemin du Paradis, the road to paradise. They bet cigarettes on which wounded would survive the journey to field hospitals. They sang macabre songs while carrying stretchers, partly to maintain rhythm, partly to drown out the moans of those they carried. By 1918, as the war approached its final phase, the role of the Brancardier had evolved. No longer just stretcher bearers, they had become battlefield medical practitioners in their own right. Many could perform procedures that before the war would have been reserved for physicians: emergency tracheotomies for gas victims, digital arterial compression to control hemorrhage, even rudimentary debridement of wounds when evacuation was impossible. The Spanish influenza pandemic that began in 1918 created new challenges. Now, in addition to battle casualties, Brancardiers found themselves evacuating men felled by disease. The crowded, unsanitary conditions of trenches provided perfect breeding grounds for the virus. Stretcher bearers, in constant contact with the sick and wounded, suffered infection rates approaching 70% during the pandemic's peak. In his memoirs published in 1923, Dr. Georges Duhamel, who served as a surgeon on the Western Front, wrote, "If this war produced any saints, they were the Brancardiers. I watched them day after day, performing impossible tasks with impossible courage. They had no weapons, no glory, no rest. Just an endless procession of broken men in their arms and the constant whistle of death in their ears. When the armistice finally came on November 11th, 1918, the Brancardiers found themselves in an unexpected role, carrying the dead rather than the wounded. The massive task of recovering bodies from no man's land fell largely to stretcher-bearer units. They recovered decomposed corpses from shell holes, disentangled remains from barbed wire, and collected bone fragments from cratered landscapes, providing closure for families who otherwise would have only known their sons, husbands, and fathers as missing. The skills developed by French Brancardiers during the war transformed civilian emergency medicine in the years that followed. Techniques for rapid assessment of trauma, field triage protocols, and emergency transport methods developed on the Western Front became standard practice in civilian ambulance services across Europe. The modern paramedic profession traces its lineage directly to the battlefield stretcher bearers of World War I. But what became of the men themselves? Post-war records are incomplete, but studies of French veterans suggest that former Brancardiers struggled to reintegrate into civilian society. Many suffered chronic physical ailments, herniated discs, arthritis in shoulders and knees, respiratory problems from gas exposure. The psychological wounds went deeper: nightmares, alcoholism, and what we now recognize as severe PTSD affected large numbers. Some found purpose in medical careers, becoming physicians, nurses, or civilian ambulance attendants. Others retreated into isolation, unable to speak about what they had seen and done. A sociological study conducted by the French government in 1925 found that former stretcher bearers had higher rates of suicide and institutionalization than other veteran groups. One former Brancardier, Pierre Laurent, wrote in his memoir published in 1930, "We who carried the broken bodies of a generation find ourselves haunted by their weight. My arms still feel the strain of the stretcher handles. My ears still ring with the sounds of men begging for morphine, for water, for their mothers. I save lives in my dreams and lose them when I wake." In 1922, France established the Order of Stretcher Bearers, Ordre des Brancardiers, a fraternal organization for veterans who had served in this capacity. By 1930s, it had over 7,000 members who gathered annually to commemorate fallen comrades and advocate for medical reforms. The organization's archives, preserved at the French Military Medical Museum in Val-de-Grâce, contain thousands of photographs, diaries, and personal effects that document the Brancardiers' experiences. Among these artifacts is a worn leather medical satchel belonging to a Brancardier named Antoine Mercier. Inside are the tools of his wartime trade: scissors for cutting away clothing from wounds, morphine ampules still in their original paper wrappers, silk sutures, bandages compressed into tight packets, and a small silver flask engraved with the words, "Pour courage," for courage. The flask still contains traces of cognac, the unofficial anesthetic that sometimes made the difference between life and death when medical supplies ran short. Also preserved is a stretcher, the standard model 1890 used throughout the war. Its wooden handles are worn smooth by the hands that gripped them. The canvas is stained with the dark brown of old blood. Painted on one handle in small white letters is a tally, vertical marks grouped in fives. The final count, 342. The number of men carried on this single stretcher during its service. The most poignant artifacts are the letters, thousands of them, sent to stretcher bearers after the war by men they had saved. One such letter, dated March 1920, reads, "You will not remember me. I was one of hundreds you carried. But I remember you. You spoke to me of vineyards and sunshine while shells fell around us. You gave me water from your own canteen. You called me brother when I had no name but my pain. I live today because you walked into hell to find me." The French government recognized the contribution of Brancardiers with the dedication of a monument at Verdun in 1929, a bronze statue depicting two stretcher bearers carrying a wounded soldier. The inscription reads simply, "Aux Brancardiers, ils ont porté le poids de notre souffrance." To the stretcher bearers, they carried the weight of our suffering. When another world war erupted in 1939, many aging Brancardiers from the Great War volunteered again, this time as trainers for a new generation. The institutional knowledge they passed on, hard-won through blood and suffering, saved countless lives on new battlefields. Their legacy lives on in modern combat medicine, in the golden hour protocols of trauma care, in the battlefield evacuation systems used by armies worldwide. The French army stretcher bearers of World War I remain largely unsung heroes, men who fought their own kind of battle without weapons, whose courage manifested not in killing, but in saving, who walked unarmed into landscapes of industrialized death, guided by duty and compassion. In the words of poet and veteran Louis Aragon, they were the light in our darkest hour, men who carried hope on canvas stretchers through fields where hope had died. In 2011, archaeologists excavating a section of the Champagne front discovered a dugout that had been used as a stretcher-bearer station in 1915. Preserved in the oxygen-poor soil were artifacts untouched for nearly a century, medical supplies, personal effects, and a small notebook. Inside, a Brancardier had kept a list, not of the dead or wounded he had carried, but of their dreams. Each entry contained a name and what that soldier had told him he would do when the war ended. Hi, Martin. Open a bakery in Lyon. Philippe, marry Josephine from the village. Henri, finish his studies and become a teacher. Thomas, see the ocean for the first time. The last entry, dated July 18th, 1915, simply reads, "They will live, they must live." Someone must remember that they were more than broken things on stretchers. They were futures interrupted. If I carry nothing else from this war, I will carry this.